Great, thanks very much. And I've been super enjoying all the conversation in the chat so far. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that the beautiful snowy land where I'm located today in what's known as Les Cantons de l'Est au Québec is the traditional and unceded territory of the Abenaki people and the Wabanaki Confederacy. So I'm very glad to be here speaking with you, some very familiar faces and familiar names, which is nice, talking about the PIEVC Green Protocol, the beta version, on integrating EBA, ecosystem-based adaptation, into infrastructure climate risk assessments. So this work was funded by GIZ and developed by NERA's IP Consult in Germany by two consultants, Wolfram Lange and myself, in collaboration with stakeholders from both Canada and internationally. Here I am. I'm a consultant and project manager with a consulting company called NERA's in Germany. I'm also an associate with the Climate Risk Institute, but you might hear from my accent, I'm also Canadian, and I've previously worked with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services, so I'm very happy to be kind of in the loop on some of these Canadian processes as well. Next slide. So the purpose of the PIEVC Green Protocol is to outline a process to assess infrastructure component responses to climate change impacts, same as the PIEVC protocol, but now also considering the broader social ecological system where the infrastructure is situated. So we're already seeing, and I've seen these from some of the PIEVC webinars going on, that many infrastructure owners, operators, and professionals are already considering the social ecological system to varying degrees when they're applying the PIEVC protocol. But now with the beta version of the PIEVC Green Protocol, we'll have a little bit more systematic guidance on how to do that. So as I'm sure you all know, infrastructure assets don't exist in a vacuum. So PIEVC Green Protocol provides a bit more guidance on considering, as we see in the figure, how the social ecological system might reduce risk of climate risk of the infrastructure, how it might also increase risk, how the infrastructure may have subsequent impacts for the broader social ecological system if it experiences some climate impacts, but also that there may be opportunities from ecosystem-based adaptation to increase resilience of both the infrastructure and the broader social ecological system. Part of our purpose with the PIEVC Green Protocol was also to take what we have that's more focused on Canada and try to make it a little bit more globally applicable as well. Next slide, please. So with the PIEVC Green Protocol, we didn't start from a blank Word document. We're not trying to create something completely new, but rather we use the PIEVC protocol as a base to mainstream social ecological systems concepts in a more targeted way. So kind of mainstreaming them throughout the PIEVC protocol. So from the original PIEVC protocol, we started with that as our base document, and we also integrated some concepts from the high-level screening guide to try to follow some of the new developments and how PIEVC is moving in our new methodology. We took all the core steps from the PIEVC protocol, we didn't change those, and we took mostly all the same activities from the PIEVC protocol as well. From the GIZ Climate Risk Assessment for Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Guideline, which you can see on the bottom left. I'm not sure how many people on the call are familiar with it. From there, we took the thinking around the social ecological systems approach and ecosystem-based adaptation, as well as some of the key methodologies like the impact chain approach and development of vulnerability indicators, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. Next slide. So here's the overall structure of the PIEVC Green Protocol. So you can see we split it up into kind of two main parts plus annexes. In this first part A on setting the scene, we talk about key concepts, especially in climate risk. So here using the IPCC AR6 risk concepts, we discuss some fundamentals of climate risk assessment and also discuss managing an interdisciplinary team, which as we're considering the broader social ecological system, the team tends to get more interdisciplinary. In part B, this is that sort of step-by-step guidance that you'll be familiar with from the original PIEVC protocol. We follow the same core 5 steps, as I mentioned, but we've also integrated the triple bottom line, those steps 6 to 8, as well into the PIEVC Green, which previously was a bit of a standalone document. We also have some annexes where we've moved a lot of the additional guidance to try to shorten the core body of the PIEVC Green protocol. And of course have our glossary there as well. And I've included the page numbers so that you can see how we've really worked very hard to try to shorten the content compared to the original PIEVC protocol. Next slide, please. So I've already mentioned a few of these, but some of the main changes overarching from the original PIEVC protocol to the PIEVC Green Protocol is a broadened scope from the infrastructure system to include also the broader social ecological system. We've integrated the concepts of ecosystem-based adaptation and ecosystem services. We have updated the climate risk concepts and terminology to align with the IPCC AR6. This goes along with what Joel was mentioning of the need to be abreast with what's going on internationally and advances in climate risk concepts. We've also tried to bring in as much content as we could from different PIEVC family of resources into one to make it a bit of a one-stop shop. So we have some key methodological information from the PIEVC vulnerability assessment module, the triple bottom line analysis module, as I mentioned, and also integrating more recent PIEVC methodology like some content from the PIEVC high-level screening guide. We've also been working to put greater emphasis on co-benefits of adaptation options and understanding of potential unintended consequences. As I mentioned, we're also broadening the applicability to regions outside of Canada and try to shorten the content to make it a little bit easier for everyone to use. So next, I'm going to go through briefly each of the main steps of the PIEVC protocol and talk about how these have changed from the original PIEVC protocol to the PIEVC Green Protocol. So in step one, as I'm sure many of you know, it involves defining which infrastructure is being assessed, the infrastructure's location, the uses of the infrastructure, climate and geographic conditions, and the severity of climate impacts and potential risks to be assessed more in detail. Overall, in the PIEVC Green, it's very similar to the original. We've, of course, placed additional emphasis on the social ecological system and included, for example, guidance that when you're defining the infrastructure's location and initial severity of impacts, you can begin to think about the broader system within which the infrastructure is located and how that may increase or decrease the climate risk to the infrastructure. Next slide, please. So the second step on data gathering and sufficiency, as you'll know from the PIEVC protocol, this involves data acquisition for the infrastructure and climate components. Here is where the bulk of the changes have been made in the PIEVC Green Protocol, and I'll just mention three of kind of the main additions or changes. So one is the addition of an impact chain. I'm not sure if some of you have worked with these before. These are an analytical tool to help you better understand, systematize, and prioritize the factors that drive risk, including to the social ecological system. So impact chains are really commonly used in other risk assessment methodology. For time, I won't go into detail on impact chains, but you can see from the general sample structure on the slide how you would map out different hazard and vulnerability factors. This is really nice when working and trying to consider the broader social ecological system, just given the breadth of factors that you need to consider. It also makes for a nice kind of tool to use in a participatory setting like a workshop, since it's quite visual and you can work with quite a number of different stakeholders or participants on it. We've also added steps to identify, select, and normalize vulnerability indicators. So meaning sensitivity and adaptive capacity or deficit. I'll just mention that we did see an earlier draft of the large portfolio assessment work, and we also thought that was a nice way to deal with this kind of negative traits of sensitivity versus positive traits of adaptive capacity. So we introduce adaptive capacity in the PIEVC Green Protocol, and then also introduce adaptive deficit as what we should be using when we're doing more of the analysis. So when we are working with vulnerability indicators, we will identify sources of sensitivity or adaptive capacity or deficit and translate them to indicators, then normalize the indicators into a unitless value with a common scale. So for example, a sensitivity factor could be the lack of vegetation on a slope next to the infrastructure asset in the context of erosion. And an indicator for this could be the percent of the slope not covered by vegetation. So this kind of methodology is directly from the GIZ climate risk assessment for ecosystem-based adaptation methodology. Next slide, please. So we've also added this middle baseline scoring approach for likelihood taken directly from the PIEVC high-level screening guide. It's not that this is something specific to considering social ecological systems, but rather sort of an evolution of how the PIEVC family of resources methodology is going. So we also wanted to bring this in. I won't speak too much more on this since you've all already seen it on the high-level screening guide. So step 3 is our climate risk assessment, which, as I'm sure you know, very close to the original PIEVC protocol. It includes combining vulnerability, exposure, and likelihood, and we still recommend including a risk assessment workshop. So here, what we've added is the weighing and aggregating of vulnerability indicators. So those are the same sensitivity or adaptive capacity or deficit indicators I was mentioning a moment ago. So for each of these sensitivity or adaptive capacity or deficit factors, we will assign a weight. Ideally, you would do this in a workshop setting to try to agree on how you'd weight these differently relative to one another. And then you aggregate them to get an overall vulnerability indicator using the formula that we have on the slide. And next slide, please. So we've maintained still the same risk matrix approach. Here, what we'll do is try to determine the risk scores for each climate infrastructure interaction. We would do an exposure analysis to determine if there's any exposure using more of a yes/no approach. We'd multiply the exposure values by the vulnerability value determined on the previous slide. And we also already have the likelihood score from step 2 using the middle baseline approach. And then we multiply the severity of impact against the likelihood to get the risk score. So again, trying to stay consistent as much as possible to the core of the PIEVC, which includes having the risk matrix there. Next slide, please. So steps 4 and 5, we really made very few changes here. We didn't find them to be necessary. Step 4 involves the optional engineering analysis, and step 5 involves making recommendations and conclusions. We did add a little bit to step 5 that you can also include consideration of the social ecological system in your recommendations and conclusions. And on to the next slide. So lastly, we have steps 6 to 8, the triple bottom line. So we have step 6, which includes identifying adaptation scenarios, step 7 involving assessing adaptation scenarios, and step 8 involving recommendations and follow-up. So again, we've stayed pretty close to the original. I'd say some of the main changes are recommending to use the impact chain already developed in step 2 as kind of a starting point for guidance. We advise to develop adaptation scenarios that could address risk to the overall system. Encouragement to identify co-benefits and unintended consequences. I think that also comes back to the comment that David McLeod had to Joel about how we can kind of increase work on adaptation and climate risk. Even when there are other big issues going on, we can try to seek out co-benefits that can try to address multiple of these issues at the same time when possible. We've also, of course, really emphasized consideration of ecosystem-based adaptation measures, and generally throughout tried to mainstream consideration of social ecological systems. So otherwise, as I mentioned previously, this triple bottom line was a separate document, and now we've brought it in into the core of the PIEVC Green Protocol. And next slide, please. So overall, we're trying to support a more robust climate risk assessments through consideration of social ecological systems approaches. If we just think of a bridge or a dam by itself and assess its climate risk without considering the broader social ecological system, we'll really be missing out on a lot of the climate risk that's present. So by bringing in some of those broader considerations, we'll be having more robust approaches. We're more aligned now with the IPCC AR6. We've made it a lot shorter. That was something that I've heard from some of the PIEVC webinars I've been listening to, was some of the challenges of the length of the original PIEVC protocol. So hopefully that'll be a little bit easier to use, and also, of course, make it a little bit more globally applicable. I might have taken out a reference to permafrost here or there and tried to make it a little bit more something that others in other countries will also be able to recognize. As I mentioned, we've tried to stay as true to the PIEVC protocol as possible in terms of the core content, the steps, and the approaches. Our hope is that those users of the PIEVC protocol, if they were to open the PIEVC Green Protocol, it will still look familiar to them. And it'll be something that hopefully will be a smooth transition if they would like to use the PIEVC Green. We also wanted to make sure that we weren't developing something from scratch, coming in totally new, but keep going with what's been working. And just to mention again, we've been really integrating a lot of approaches and concepts also from the GIZ climate risk assessment for EBA guidance. as well as from the variety of PIEVC family of resources like the high-level screening guide, the triple bottom line module, and a little bit from the large portfolio assessment. So I'll stop there, and please do let me know if there are any questions.